Asterisk, it all started the day I received a knock on the door from a woman named Marcia Dellington, the HOA president of our gated community, Pinecrest Heights, her pearl necklace rattling slightly as she pursed her lips, holding out a clipboard like it was a summons from the heavens themselves, and I, still wearing my gardening gloves and covered in sawdust from building a new birdhouse, blinked in confusion until she launched into her complaint with practiced condescension, declaring that the massive oak tree in my front yard, my 100-year-old oak tree that had stood there long before any of our homes were even built, was, according to her words, an unsightly obstruction of community aesthetics and, more specifically, ruined the view of the rolling hills for the residents of Lot 27, which happened to be her property, and I stood there stunned, glancing back at the tree, its bark rough and noble, its branches sprawling in elegant, ancient arcs, home to generations of owls, squirrels, and dappled shadows that cooled my lawn every summer, and wondered what kind of warped logic could ever consider this majestic piece of living history a problem. But Marcia was firm, shoving the clipboard into my hands, which contained a violation notice and a demand to remove the tree within 30 days or face escalating fines starting at $200 per week. And I tried to reason with her, asking if perhaps a compromise could be reached, or if she was aware of how ecologically valuable old-growth oaks were, not to mention how it boosted local property values and prevented soil erosion. But she only sniffed, adjusted her sunglasses, and said, "Your property belongs to a community, not just to you," before walking off like she'd already won. And I stood there, jaw clenched, heart pounding, not because of the threat, but because of the sheer arrogance it took to try and erase a century of nature for the sake of a marginally improved view. And while most might have panicked, or maybe given in and started looking for a cheap arborist, I did the opposite. I went to war. But not with chainsaws or protests. No, I went to war with research. And over the next week I pored through city ordinances, environmental protection laws, historical society guidelines, and urban planning documents. And that's when I discovered something beautiful. My county had a historic tree protection program, rarely used, nearly forgotten, but still legally binding. And it allowed any resident to petition for the official protection of a tree if it met criteria including age, ecological importance, and local significance. And guess what? My oak qualified on all counts. It was confirmed by a licensed arborist to be between 98 and 105 years old. It supported 3 bird species currently on the local conservation watch list, and it was visible on pre-development aerial survey maps from the 1920s, meaning it had outlasted farming, highways, and subdivisions. And so I compiled every document, every photo, every soil test, even a testimonial from a local historian who'd lived in Pinecrest Heights for over 40 years and remembered climbing that exact tree as a child when it still stood alone on the ridge. And I filed the petition with the city's Environmental and Historical Preservation Office, all while pretending to comply with the HOA's orders, carefully stalling with vague updates and requests for second opinions. And meanwhile I printed yard signs that read "Save the Oak" and stuck them near the sidewalk, which caught the attention of passing dog walkers, joggers, and especially the parents of the local elementary school just 3 blocks away, who'd often brought their kids to my yard to see the owls nesting each spring. And soon the petition grew public, over 500 online signatures in 5 days, dozens of letters sent to city council, even a small write-up in the local paper titled "A Century in the Shade, the Battle to Save Pinecrest's Oldest Tree." And Marcia, oh, she was furious, showing up twice to threaten me with legal action, claiming I was weaponizing the public against the HOA. But I calmly reminded her that public easement laws allowed for freedom of signage, and besides, nothing in the HOA charter prohibited environmental activism, which I knew because I had a copy printed, highlighted, and bound in a folder thicker than her overpriced handbag. And then, just 1 week before the HOA's removal deadline, I received the official letter. The city of Maple County had approved my petition, and my oak tree was now legally classified as a protected historical tree, permanently shielded from removal, trimming, or damage by private entities, including homeowner associations, with violations punishable by fines of up to $25,000. And I framed that letter and mounted it right next to the new brass plaque the city installed at the base of the trunk, which read, "Protected Historical Oak Established Circa 1923, and I'll never forget the look on Marcia's face. When she walked by during her daily HOA patrol and saw it, her jaw literally dropped, her mouth flapping like she'd just seen a ghost in a business suit, and I gave her a little wave from my porch, sipping iced tea and leaning back in the shade of the very branches she tried to destroy. And in the weeks that followed, the entire neighborhood began to shift. People started paying attention to the HOA's overreach, questioning fines, reading bylaws, forming a community rights committee. And little by little, Marcia's grip loosened, her board meetings thinned, and her influence evaporated like dew in morning sunlight. All because she underestimated the power of one stubborn man and one ancient tree that refused to fall. After the city approved the historical protection order for my 100-year-old oak, the entire energy of Pinecrest Heights began to shift like the quiet before a storm, or perhaps the sunrise before a long-awaited revolution, because once word spread that a resident had successfully outmaneuvered the HOA, not with shouting or vandalism, but with legal finesse, city ordinances, and calm determination, more neighbors who had quietly endured petty harassment, absurd fines, and intimidation began to rise up, not in chaos, but with order, logic, and facts. And it wasn't long before my mailbox became a Dropbox of stories, notes from elderly residents fined for unapproved wind chimes, young couples penalized for non-standard mulch coloration, and even a veteran who had been forced to remove a small American flag mounted on his porch because it wasn't attached at a board-approved angle. And these weren't exaggerations, they were real, documented abuses of power carried out under the nose of a community too afraid or too tired to fight back. Until now, and it all stemmed from that single tree, that giant piece of living history that had rooted not just into the soil, but into the hearts of people who suddenly remembered that their homes weren't prisons and their yards weren't stage props for some curated magazine fantasy run by HOA board members with superiority complexes and color charts. And so I hosted the first ever Tree Talk under the oak's canopy, inviting neighbors to bring chairs, drinks, and copies of their HOA notices. And to my surprise, over 40 families showed up that Sunday afternoon, bringing lemonade, binders, and stories, so many stories that by sunset we had created a spreadsheet of nearly 200 unjust fines and violations issued by Marcia Dellington's board over the past 3 years, many of which lacked proper hearing documentation, public vote records, or even proof of violation. And with that data, I partnered with a local attorney, one who specialized in homeowners' rights and who had read about the tree battle in the paper, and together we filed a formal complaint with the County Housing Commission requesting an audit of Pinecrest Heights HOA. And when the audit was approved, it revealed a mountain of misconduct, unauthorized expenditures, improper election procedures, and even a shady landscaping contract awarded to Marcia's cousin for twice the standard market rate, which led to her immediate suspension. Pending investigation, and within a month, the board dissolved under pressure and a new election was held, this time properly monitored and open to all residents. And while I had no intention of running, the community insisted, and so I accepted the nomination not because I wanted power, but because I had learned the truth. When good people stay quiet, bad rules win, and when we forget that even a single voice can protect a forest, we lose what makes home worth fighting for. And so I became HOA president by unanimous vote. And the first thing we did was rewrite the charter from scratch, not to create more restrictions, but to restore balance, fairness, and humanity into the system. And among our first new policies were the Natural Rights Clause, which protected all trees over 50 years old unless they posed a proven safety hazard. The Creative Freedom Act, which allowed homeowners to paint, decorate, and landscape freely within reason. And the Due Process Guarantee, which made it illegal for the HOA to issue fines without a formal hearing, 72-hour notice, and proof of violation. And once these changes went into effect, the mood of the entire neighborhood transformed. Yards bloomed with color and personality, porches filled with laughter instead of tension, and the once sterile streets of Pinecrest Heights began to feel like a living, breathing village, not a plastic dollhouse under surveillance, and that tree in my oak became the symbol of it all. With school kids visiting on field trips, an annual picnic called the Roots Festival, and even a plaque placed by the mayor honoring the site as a landmark of civic action. And as for Marcia, she tried to sue for defamation but failed miserably, eventually selling her house quietly and relocating to another gated community, where I sincerely hoped she'd find peace or at least an HOA more tolerant of squirrels. And I'll never forget the moment it all came full circle, when I was standing under the branches of that magnificent oak, now taller and grander than ever, with a little girl tugging at my sleeve, asking, "Is it true you saved this tree?" And I knelt down and said, "No, sweetheart, the tree saved us." Because that's what it really did. It reminded a neighborhood that nature isn't the enemy, that rules without compassion rot from within, and that even in a world of concrete and bylaws, there is still room for something ancient, wild, and rooted. And as I looked out over the crowd gathered for that year's Roots Festival, as music played and neighbors laughed in a park that once feared even a lawn gnome, I knew we'd done more than change the rules. We'd planted something stronger than laws. We'd planted pride, unity, and freedom, and like the tree, it would stand for generations to come.